In the year 146 before the Common Era, on the northern coast of Africa, there stood a city that had once rivaled Rome itself in wealth, influence, and ambition. A city whose harbours were filled with ships and whose streets echoed with the sounds of trade, conversation, and daily life. And yet, within a short span of time, this city would be erased so completely that later generations would struggle to understand how it had ever existed at all, because Carthage did not fall by accident, and it did not fall quickly, but instead was brought to an end through years of fear, suspicion, and deliberate choice by a rival that had decided survival could only be guaranteed if Carthage no longer existed. And for the people who lived there, this decision would shape every moment of their final years. Long before Roman legions surrounded the city, Carthage had been one of the most important centres of the Western Mediterranean, founded centuries earlier by Phoenician settlers who had chosen its location carefully, building their city on a peninsula with access to fertile land and protected waters, a place well suited for trade, defence, and expansion. And over time, Carthage grew into a powerful maritime state whose influence stretched across North Africa, southern Iberia, and the islands scattered throughout the sea. Its strength came not only from soldiers, but from merchants, sailors, and craftsmen whose work connected distant regions into a single economic network. And for ordinary people living in Carthage, daily life revolved around markets, workshops, harbours, and homes that reflected generations of prosperity built on commerce rather than conquest alone. Rome, meanwhile, was rising along a different path, expanding outward from the Italian peninsula through a culture shaped by land warfare, discipline, and political competition. And when these two powers finally came into direct conflict, the result was not a single war, but a long rivalry that would last more than a century, remembered later as the Punic Wars, conflicts that were fought across land and sea and left deep scars on both societies. For those who lived through the earliest phases of this rivalry, the danger may have felt distant at times, as battles were fought far from the city walls and treaties were signed that promised peace. And even after Carthage suffered devastating defeats and was forced to accept harsh terms imposed by Rome, the city did not disappear, instead adapting, rebuilding its economy, and slowly recovering its wealth. And to many Carthaginians, this recovery may have felt like proof that survival was still possible, that as long as they followed Rome's demands and avoided further conflict, their city could endure. Yet within Rome, memory and fear did not fade so easily, because stories of earlier defeats, of Roman armies destroyed and Italian lands invaded, were preserved and retold, shaping how Roman leaders viewed Carthage long after its military power had been reduced. And as Carthage's prosperity returned, even in limited form, it was interpreted not as harmless recovery, but as a warning that the old rival could one day rise again. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome had become the dominant power of the Mediterranean world, confident in its armies and its destiny, and increasingly unwilling to tolerate the existence of any state that might challenge its authority. And within this atmosphere, a belief took hold among Roman elites that Carthage's continued survival was itself a threat, regardless of its actions, regardless of its treaties, and regardless of the ordinary people who lived within its walls. This belief did not arise suddenly, but grew over time through speeches, debates, and repeated reminders of past dangers. And perhaps the most famous expression of this mindset came from the Roman statesman Cato the Elder, who ended many of his speeches, regardless of the topic, with the same conclusion, that Carthage must be destroyed, a phrase that reflected not anger in the moment, but a long-standing conviction that peace could only be achieved through elimination. For Carthage, this shift in Roman thinking marked the beginning of a slow and irreversible descent toward destruction, even though life within the city continued much as it always had, with families raising children, merchants negotiating prices, and ships coming and going from the harbours. because the decision to destroy Carthage was made far from its streets, in political spaces where the voices of its inhabitants were never heard. When Rome finally moved against Carthage once more, it did so with careful preparation and overwhelming force, framing the conflict as a necessary action rather than an act of aggression. And when Roman forces arrived in North Africa, they brought with them demands that went far beyond previous treaties, demands that were designed not to be negotiated, but to force a choice that would justify war. At first, Carthage complied, as it always had, surrendering hostages, weapons, and ships, in the hope that obedience would once again secure peace, and for a time, it may have seemed that these sacrifices would be enough, that Rome would be satisfied, and that the city could endure yet another humiliation in exchange for survival. But then came the final demand, one that stripped away all remaining illusions, when Roman commanders ordered the people of Carthage to abandon their city entirely and rebuild elsewhere, away from the sea, effectively erasing the place that had defined their identity for centuries. And for the people who heard this order, it became clear that survival no longer meant submission alone, but the loss of everything that made their lives recognizable. Faced with this choice, Carthage resisted, not because it believed victory was likely, but because the alternative was unthinkable. And as Roman legions tightened their grip around the city, what followed was not a swift collapse, but a prolonged siege that transformed daily life into a struggle for endurance. Inside the walls, resources became scarce as supply routes were cut, and the routines that once structured life began to break down as food grew harder to find, materials were repurposed for defense, and every able person was drawn into the effort to survive another day. And while Roman armies prepared their assaults methodically, the people of Carthage adapted as best they could, reinforcing walls, crafting weapons from melted tools and ornaments, and reorganizing their city around the demands of defense rather than commerce. The siege did not simply test military strength, but patience, resilience, and the limits of human endurance, and as months turned into years, hunger, exhaustion, and fear became constant companions for those trapped inside. While outside, Roman soldiers waited, built fortifications, and applied pressure with the confidence that time itself was on their side. For ordinary Carthaginians, the siege reshaped every aspect of existence, as children grew up knowing only scarcity, as families were separated by duty and death, and as the familiar sounds of trade were replaced by the noise of construction, shouting, and distant fighting. And even as hope faded, resistance continued, not as a strategy for victory, but as a refusal to disappear quietly. This was not the fall of a city caught unprepared, but the final chapter of a rivalry defined by memory and fear, where the fate of tens of thousands was sealed long before the walls were breached, and where survival was no longer a matter of chance or courage, but of decisions made by a power determined to ensure that Carthage would never rise again. As the siege dragged on, the rhythm of life inside Carthage became defined less by days and nights, and more by the slow erosion of strength, because while the city had once thrived on movement and exchange, it was now sealed in place, its people confined within walls that both protected and trapped them. And as Roman forces tightened their encirclement, access to food, water, and materials grew increasingly uncertain, forcing difficult choices that reshaped every household and neighborhood. At first, stored grain and supplies were rationed carefully, measured out in ways that reflected hope that the siege would not last forever. But as months passed and relief never came, those calculations grew harsher, and hunger became a daily reality rather than a distant fear, altering how people thought, spoke, and acted. Markets that had once been places of negotiation and abundance turned into silent spaces or were repurposed entirely, as tools, furniture, and even decorative objects were broken down and reused to reinforce defences or create weapons. And the wealth that had once defined Carthage lost its meaning when survival depended not on coins or trade, but on calories and endurance. The Roman army outside the walls was patient and systematic, constructing earthworks, cutting off access to the sea, and testing Carthaginian defences through repeated engagements that wore down resistance without committing to a single decisive assault. And this strategy placed the burden of time squarely on those inside the city, who understood that every passing day made their situation worse, while Rome's position only grew stronger. Within Carthage, men, women, and even children were drawn into the defence, not because of ideology or loyalty to distant leaders, but because the survival of families and neighbours depended on collective effort, and so workshops became armories, homes became storage spaces for weapons, and entire districts were reorganised to support the walls and towers that stood between the city and destruction. The psychological toll of this transformation was profound, as people accustomed to predictable routines found themselves living in a state of constant uncertainty, listening for signs of attack, counting dwindling supplies, and adjusting to the absence of any clear future beyond the next day. And while leaders attempted to maintain order and morale, their authority rested increasingly on necessity rather than confidence. As starvation intensified, difficult decisions became unavoidable, and the social fabric of the city strained under pressure. As families competed for limited resources, as illness spread more easily among the malnourished, and as grief became a shared experience rather than an isolated tragedy, with funerary practices altered or abandoned entirely because the living could no longer spare the time or energy to honour the dead as they once had. Meanwhile, Roman commanders observed and waited, aware that the city's strength was being consumed from within, and when they finally moved to breach Carthage's defences, they did so with overwhelming force and preparation, initiating assaults that pushed beyond the outer walls and into the streets themselves, transforming the siege into a brutal urban struggle that unfolded neighbourhood by neighbourhood. For those trapped inside, the fighting was disorienting and relentless, as familiar streets became battlegrounds, homes were fortified or destroyed, and the distinction between civilian and combatant disappeared entirely, because survival required participation regardless of age or status. Resistance continued not because victory was expected, but because surrender offered no safety, and as Roman troops advanced deeper into the city, they encountered resistance that reflected desperation rather than strategy, with defenders fighting from rooftops, narrow alleys, and improvised barricades, prolonging the struggle at immense cost. The final days of Carthage were marked by exhaustion and inevitability. As fires spread, structures collapsed, and the remaining population was driven toward the city's centre, where the last organised resistance took place. And even then, the fighting did not end quickly, as Rome's victory came not through a single moment of triumph, but through relentless pressure that extinguished resistance piece by piece. When the fighting finally ceased, what remained of Carthage was no longer a functioning city, but a devastated landscape of ruins, smoke, and silence. And for the survivors, survival itself became a burden rather than a relief, because Roman policy left no room for recovery or rebuilding. Those who were not killed during the assault were captured, enslaved, or displaced, stripped of their homes, identities, and connection to the place that had defined their lives. And the city itself was systematically dismantled, its buildings destroyed, its infrastructure erased, and its land repurposed under Roman control, ensuring that Carthage would not re-emerge as a political or cultural force. The destruction was not symbolic or temporary, but thorough and intentional, reflecting a belief that security required the complete removal of a rival, not just its defeat. And this decision reshaped the Mediterranean world, eliminating a major centre of trade and altering patterns of movement, economy, and power for generations. For Rome, the fall of Carthage represented the resolution of a long-standing fear, the closure of a rivalry that had shaped its history, and the confirmation of its dominance. But for the people who had lived within Carthage's walls, it marked the end of a way of life that had no opportunity to adapt or recover. In the aftermath, Carthage became a warning rather than a memory, a reminder of what could happen when political decisions were driven by suspicion and the desire for absolute security. And while Rome would go on to face its own challenges and eventual decline, the lesson of Carthage remained embedded in its history, illustrating the cost of survival defined not by coexistence, but by elimination. For those who lived through the final years of Carthage, survival was never guaranteed, not because of natural disaster or sudden invasion, but because their fate was decided long before the walls fell, in debates and speeches far from the city itself, where the lives of ordinary people were reduced to abstractions in a larger struggle for power. And when that struggle ended, it left behind not a conquered city, but an empty space where Carthage had once stood, silent proof that even the greatest centers of civilization could vanish when survival was no longer part of the calculation. In the years that followed the destruction of Carthage, the physical absence of the city became as significant as its violent end, because where bustling neighborhoods, temples, harbors, and homes had once stood, there was now an intentional emptiness imposed by Roman authority, a landscape reshaped not to preserve memory but to erase it, and this absence served a political purpose just as much as the siege itself had, reminding anyone who passed through the region that Rome's decisions were final and that resistance, no matter how determined, could be reduced to silence. The land that had supported generations of Carthaginian families was confiscated and reorganized, transformed into Roman territory where new settlements would eventually arise under different names and different laws. And yet for a long time, the ruins remained a visible reminder of what had been lost, fragments of walls and scorched foundations, standing as mute witnesses to a deliberate act of destruction. For those who survived and were forced into slavery, displacement, or exile, Carthage did not simply end in 146 BC, but continued to exist as a memory carried into unfamiliar places, where former citizens struggled to adapt to lives defined by separation from their homeland and from one another, their identities reshaped by circumstances they had no power to influence. In Roman narratives, Carthage's destruction was often framed as a necessary act, a decisive solution to a long-standing threat, and over time, this version of events hardened into accepted history, emphasizing Roman security and stability while minimizing the human cost paid by those on the losing side. And this imbalance in memory highlights how power determines not only outcomes, but how those outcomes are remembered. For ordinary Romans, the fall of Carthage may have felt distant, another chapter in a long series of wars that expanded the empire's reach. But its consequences were felt indirectly through increased wealth, new lands, and a growing sense of inevitability surrounding Roman dominance, reinforcing the belief that Rome's survival depended on strength without compromise. Yet the logic that justified Carthage's erasure did not remain isolated to that single event, because once elimination became an acceptable solution, it shaped how Rome approached future conflicts, encouraging policies that prioritized control and deterrence over coexistence. And in this way, Carthage's fate became a precedent as much as a conclusion. For historians looking back, the destruction of Carthage offers insight into the fragile balance between security and fear, illustrating how a powerful state can become so focused on preventing future threats that it chooses actions that eliminate not only rivals, but entire communities, cultures, and histories. And while Rome achieved its immediate goal of removing Carthage from the political landscape, it also set a pattern that would influence its own trajectory in the centuries to come. From the perspective of those who lived through Carthage's final years, survival was shaped by forces far beyond individual choice or effort, as people adapted, resisted, and endured within the limits imposed by a prolonged siege and an uncompromising enemy, and their experiences remind us that the outcomes of great conflicts are lived not in speeches or treaties, but in homes, streets, and bodies subjected to prolonged stress and uncertainty. Hunger, fear, and exhaustion became defining features of daily life, altering relationships and priorities as people learned to navigate a world where the future had been effectively cancelled, replaced by a present that demanded constant vigilance and sacrifice. And this prolonged state of crisis reshaped what survival meant, reducing it to the ability to endure one more day under conditions that stripped away comfort, security, and hope. The fall of Carthage also underscores how cities are more than physical structures, because even after its walls were torn down and its streets destroyed, the idea of Carthage persisted in memory. In stories told by survivors, and later by historians, who attempted to reconstruct what had been lost, and this persistence challenges the notion that destruction alone can erase a civilization entirely. Over time, Rome itself would build a new city on the same site, incorporating the land into its empire and transforming it into a Roman colony, a development that further complicated the legacy of Carthage by overlaying new identities onto the same space. Yet even then, the shadow of the earlier city remained, influencing how the location was understood and remembered. The decision to destroy Carthage rather than simply conquer it reveals a moment when power, fear, and ambition converged in a way that left no room for moderation, and this moment serves as a reminder that survival in the ancient world was often contingent not on morality or justice, but on the calculations of those who wielded authority, calculations that could render entire populations expendable. As centuries passed, the story of Carthage became part of a broader historical narrative about the rise of empires and the costs associated with their expansion, offering lessons that extend beyond the ancient Mediterranean to other times and places where similar dynamics have played out. And in this sense, Carthage's destruction resonates not because of its uniqueness, but because of its familiarity within the broader patterns of human conflict. For modern audiences looking back, the fall of Carthage invites reflection on how societies remember their victories and justify their actions, and on how easily the experiences of ordinary people can be overshadowed by the narratives of power and success that dominate historical memory. And by focusing on the lived reality of those who endured the siege and its aftermath, the story shifts from one of abstract rivalry to one of human vulnerability within systems beyond individual control. In the end, Carthage was not simply defeated, but deliberately removed from the map, its destruction serving as a final statement in a rivalry that had shaped the ancient world for generations. And for those who survived its final days, survival meant carrying the memory of a city that no longer existed, a city whose absence became its most enduring legacy. This absence reminds us that history is shaped as much by what is destroyed as by what endures, and that the decisions made in pursuit of security can leave behind consequences that outlast the conflicts themselves, shaping how future generations understand power, survival, and the cost of fear-driven choices. And as the Mediterranean world moved forward under Roman dominance, the empty space where Carthage once stood remained a silent testament to a moment when survival was no longer part of the plan, and an entire city paid the price.